Hey guys, we're back again with another video from Warfronts, and this video should provide plenty to talk about for you guys to engage with because it's called Which Countries Will Get Nukes Next? So obviously that implies that countries will get them, and we'll see what they got here. Hey, this original video is linked down below. Make sure you're supporting Warfronts. Let's get started. Another question that just popped into mind is like, which countries should get nukes next, if any? I think that's an interesting one. Now, you might look at a lot of current issues and say that that more or less provides justification for a country having nukes. So we'll see if that intertwines here, but that's another discussion I think we could have. All right, let's see what Simon's got.
All right, look, just before we begin today, got to talk about Iran. Look at the time this episode was made. Originally, Iran and Israel had not yet engaged in the 12-day undeclared war that was fought in June 2025. As a result, we're going to refer to Iran's nuclear capabilities as they were understood prior to that exchange.
Okay, I see.
Iran's current nuclear capability is somewhat diminished. The US Pentagon estimated in early July that Iran's nuclear program was set back, quote, 1 to 2 years.
So if I guess we've been living under a rock. If you're coming back to the Warfronts, you probably saw the videos and stuff that I was covering about Iran and Israel and things like that. So famously, you know, here last month, United States participated in an airstrike against sites where uranium was being enriched to levels that the United States believed was reaching the levels required for a nuclear weapon. And again, the claim right now is the destruction of those sites again has set them back, and we'll see what's going to have to happen next is what agreements might there be in the near future about the future of that program, because there was again a deal a few years ago that was a lift that came in during kind of the Obama administration that kept those enrichment levels down, but then pulling out of that agreement, you saw with the Trump administration, you saw then the enriching of uranium went up. So that deal was now basically null and void. So we'll see what negotiations or anything happen for the potential of what Iran would be allowed to do, I guess, in the eyes of countries like the United States when it comes to that enrichment level. So that's what they're talking about here. All right. But so they're going back to when they did when they were much closer to having that kind of nuclear weapon capability. So that is important, I think, to set up.
Therefore, we present this analysis and these conclusions as they were originally written. And with that said, today's episode. Okay. Mutually assured destruction. It's the rule that humankind seems just barely able to live with, but utterly incapable of living without. From the moment that the world first became host to multiple nuclear powers at once, it's mutually assured destruction that has kept the world in line. The solemn problem.
One of the things I love to have a discussion with my students is the effectiveness and kind of analysis of the mutually assured destruction argument. And if you don't know what that means, essentially that there's enough nukes in the world that if you were to engage in a nuclear war with somebody, like strike somebody with a nuclear war, you would then be destroyed by nukes because enough exists to destroy basically any country. And even if it gets far enough, could, pretty much destroy the planet. So the I guess discussion that is interesting to have with students is that making the world safer? Now, of course, there have been wars since, World War II and the use of atomic bombs, and the United States exclusively had them. But what do you think has been the impact of that? And going forward, is it still kind of a safe idea, I guess, to sort of rely on that for future safety? Or you get to the argument about how it just takes one nation to make a really dumb mistake or, a decision, depending on who has them, to, launch that kind of strike, and then we have that catastrophe. So usually provides a really interesting discussion. I'd love to know what you guys think of the effect of the MAD principle. Let us know down below.
Is that if anybody uses their nuclear weapons, then we're all using our nuclear weapons. Right now, 9 world nations possess the bomb, and each of them exists in a deadly serious
Do you think that's even true, though?
With all the others.
That it would result in that?
France and Britain use the bomb. If Pakistan uses the bomb, India uses the bomb. If America uses the bomb, then China and North Korea use the bomb too.
Do you think that's inevitable, though? Do you not think it would end up being maybe like 1-to-1, if 2 countries did go to war and they both had nuclear weapons, and one launched for whatever reason, and then maybe one launches in retaliation, do you think it's assured that it would go further than that? Because that's what a mutually assured destruction is kind of assuming, is that's the case, that just everyone, you're launching all of them and everything gets destroyed. But you think we can make that assumption? It can't just be tit for tat and then that's it?
Nations, all of them with the leverage to keep each other in line as long as nobody comes along to upset the balance. But right now, a growing number of other nations across the globe seem to want to go nuclear. Iran, by some standards, is just days away. South Korea is seriously exploring the possibility. Poland's weighing its options. And that's already bad enough. More nuclear-armed actors lead to greater risk that someone, for some reason, will finally push the big red button that we've all managed to avoid since 1945. The real
Now, would you agree that it is in a country's best interest to have nuclear weapons, again, as a deterrent? Now, it becomes difficult now because, you know, it's a small group of nations that have been very threatening to a lot of other countries about their programs. But is it in a country's best interest to have nuclear weapons? I dare say it kind of is, because it is a major deterrent. One thing I'll be interested to see if they end up bringing in here, and if they don't, I'll try to, maybe I can find a way to interject a little bit, is the history of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Because if you don't know that story, it's very interesting. And maybe you're seeing it play out a little bit with the current war that they're in, and how it may have been either avoided or changed, or even, I don't know, become even that mad destruction thing if Ukraine had nukes. Anyways, let's see.
Trouble, however, comes by way of a nuclear cascade. One new nation gets the bomb, so does another, and another after that. It's this sort of cascade that keeps arms control experts.
How do you decide who gets it and who doesn't?
It's this kind of cascade that the world hopes to prevent
and who decides?
Through all manner of treaties and agreements. But what if these contingencies start to fail? Today, we're not simply going to discuss the small handful of nuclear curious nations that have made the headlines. Instead, we're going to really play this thing out. If these nations do get the bomb,
an alternate history?
Who else will, and who else after that? Today, we're...
Love that. By the way, if you like alternate history, we have a series. We started it. You may not have seen it as much in the recommendations, but we have it. It's currently called Alternate History, Histerry. Kind of dorky, but we've done 2 episodes. And number 3 is going to be in production here soon. Check them out.
Diving headfirst into a worst-case scenario, one that leaves the world with no fewer than 20 nuclear nations by the year 2040, and even that might prove to be an understatement.
Because that's like double 20, you know, what we have now. So.
Shifting world order. In the early months of 2025, the global nuclear order has started to shift. But despite the worst fears of a generation's worth of Iran hawks, the global West has found that the calls are now coming from inside the house. 2 longtime allies of the NATO alliance appear to be seriously considering the prospect that they might become the 10th and 11th world nations to acquire nuclear weapons. According to experts in and out of both nations, there's a real strategic argument to take the leap, but a real argument that either acquisition could turn the wider world on its head. The first nation in question is Poland, where during remarks...
Now, you think of what is the biggest motivating factor? Is a direct threat on a country that would lead them to get nukes. Now, one thing we can also, understand is the spreading of nuclear technology obviously is in the hands of countries that have that. So that will always be a factor. It may not be a country, needing to develop that technology just from scratch, or the materials, make friends with a country that does have it. Now there are some agreements, non-poliferation treaty, that basically all but Israel has agreed to it, that has mutual agreements about, how this technology is used and kind of keeping it under wraps and that sort of thing. But a country could secretly give that up. You know what I mean? That's something else that would have to, I guess, be talked about for this alternate scenario. Like Poland, how would Poland get it? Would it be from another country or just having their own program?
The world on its head. The first nation in question is Poland.
So would it be a Russian threat to Poland that motivates this?
Tusk made history. In an address to Parliament, in which Tusk called for Poland to build an army 500,000 strong, the Polish PM also called for his nation to avoid restricting itself to conventional weapons. Said Tusk, "We must be aware that Poland must reach for the most modern capabilities also related to nuclear weapons and modern unconventional weapons. This is a race for security, not for war." Calling out Ukraine's...
Basically, when he said, when you're saying that for security, it's deterrence. Nobody would mess with you. So what would be Poland's direct adversarial issue? Is it, they're going to get invaded again by Germany? That seems less likely, I would think. Is it with Russia? Because they've been invaded by both countries in their history, and not even their distant history, even within the last 100 years, multiple times. So what do you think would be the context for that?
Decision to give up its. This is a race for security, not for war. Calling out Ukraine's decision to give up its nuclear weapons after the Cold War and the many injustices Ukraine has suffered from Russia ever since, Tusk emphasized the importance of Poland securing a nuclear deterrent, ideally through cooperation with nuclear nations like France, but possibly through a Polish nuclear program if the nation's allies couldn't do the job. Poland also hosted nuclear weapons during the Cold War, but those weapons were removed in 1991 in a stark and striking parallel with Ukraine.
So the Soviet Union, right, had control and alliances, one way or the other, with a lot of countries, right, in Eastern Europe. So you had Poland, then you had Ukraine. And during the Cold War, there were nukes in those countries. Now, when the Soviet Union falls apart, those nukes are still there, right? So as these countries get their autonomy, it brought in the discussion about what should happen with those nukes. So I'd say, I guess, the Soviet Union had fallen, or those states had fallen. What should happen to them? Should the new country then have them? Now with Ukraine, they kind of made an agreement, which was that they would give up those nukes. Now they had those in their possession. From what I understand, though, the actual launch capability, launch codes, and all the stuff that's required to launch those, I believe, were still held by the Soviet Union, if I remember that right. And so that was already kind of like problematic, I guess, for Ukraine in some way. But nevertheless, they agreed to give them up. Now, what they had was assurances from other Western countries, even though they weren't going to be joining NATO, was that there would be security there. Now, that whole thing, it was called the Budapest Memorandum, has come under scrutiny now because of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, which brings up the question I was kind of thinking about earlier and telling you about, which is if Ukraine still had its nukes, I guess, whether or not they could, by now figure out a way to, I don't know, bypass launch codes or however that works, would there then have been a invasion by Russia? And then in the other end of that, with the memorandum, also hoping for and basically getting assurances from other countries for help, and them not really giving the direct aid. I mean, there's been financial aid, some weapons aids, of course, to Ukraine, but it seems in that situation, Ukraine kind of got the worst end of both of those, right? So it's not going to be a deterrent for an invasion because they gave up their nukes and didn't get maybe some of the assurances that they had. So that is coming into question. So it looks like that's kind of what Ukraine's position has been in, is putting Poland in a position to think about that same idea. It's like, okay, maybe they don't have nearly as much of the history they have like with Ukraine. And if you hear about, some of the deeper underlining motivations for Russia with a lot of their ancestry coming from Ukraine and some of that, having that tie being very strong as compared to like Poland. But is that motivating then Poland to be like, we don't want to end up like a Ukraine? And is Russia that potential enemy? So it does bring in a good question. What should happen, you think, from an international scene with a place like Poland? Should they be allowed to get nuclear weapons, I guess? If so, do they need to do it on their own? Should they get help? How will this upset geopolitics right now?
Weapons were removed in 1991 in a stark and striking parallel with Ukraine. It's the boldest and most definitive step Poland
giving theirs up too
so far in a years-long effort to step up its own security and become Europe's new nuclear powerhouse. Across the continent, there is perhaps no other nation that's learned the lessons of the Russian invasion of Ukraine more acutely than Poland, where there is a deep cultural memory of occupation and war at the hands of the Soviets, the Nazis, and other world powers going back across time.
It does kind of seem like Poland has the most history to look upon about being invaded from multiple people to want to have something that can be a maximum level of deterrence, but we'll see. Is anyone gunning for Poland right now?
Since Tusk's address, Poland has further confirmed its interest in acquiring a nuclear deterrent on its own soil, calling for the United States to deploy nuclear weapons to Poland and deepening conversations with France to the same effect. Yet,
does that call, do you guys know, is because they're saying like U.S. to move nuclear weapons to Polish territory, but does that mean that the Polish have full control over those, or would it be the United States? You really think the United States would just drop them there and be like, here's the keys? You know what I mean? What do you think about that?
Yet the idea that Poland would procure its own warheads if France and the United States failed to come through appears to still be on the table, rather than prompting backlash. Tusk's overtures built on a growing public sentiment in Poland that nuclear sharing, at the very least, would be in the nation's interest. In February of this year, nearly 53% of Poles even supported the idea that Poland should acquire its own nuclear weapons.
I mean, given a lot of opinions and stuff, I don't do a ton of that on here. Should I prevent you guys, or just propose you guys with these different takes and maybe providing some nuance? But doesn't it seem like it'd be in your best interest to have nukes? Like, what would be the downside, I guess? I mean, they're very expensive. That's for one thing too. And then there's also the risk of escalation of conflict as well. So yeah, again, what do you just think about that just in general, I guess?
Then there's the second Western ally in question, South Korea. There, the idea of
American ally,
homegrown nuclear deterrent has been in public circulation for a bit longer than in Poland's, with the country's now former defense minister, Kim Jong-hyun, raising the possibility in his confirmation hearings in September 2024.
And I mean, he's going to bring it up, but it should be obvious, right, of what their concern would be. Are they concerned about a North Korea, which does have those weapons? So would South Korea have that? Now, what's led South Korea to not having that, of course, is incredible amount of assurance and investment from the United States ever since the Korean War. Well, ever since Korea got its independence from Japan, really, and the United States, building up that country with allies inside. But that is just someone, we don't talk about that one as much with like South Korea, but directly to a neighbor that they have had a war with. And there's still people alive that went through that conflict in the 1950s.
In those hearings, a few months before Kim would resign around South Korea's whole martial law situation later that year, Kim made an argument to national policymakers that South Korea should treat acquiring nuclear weapons as a serious option to respond to North Korea's nuclear threat. It was just the latest in a long barrage of statements by South Korean leaders to that effect, all indicating a growing willingness to seek out its own nuclear deterrent, both for purposes of dealing with North Korea's arsenal and to gain leverage with the United States. Since January of this year, interest within South Korea has only continued to ramp up as demands heaping onto Seoul from Washington, D.C. prompt experts and policymakers alike to give serious thought to the idea.
One of the things that North Korea, especially into their independence, was also kind of platforming was their history of being invaded. Korea had a long history of being like a tributary state and under threat of China for centuries and centuries. And then most recently with Japan, right? They've kind of been, I guess, victims of imperialism, I guess you would say, and really used that kind of anti-imperialist platform to get a lot of support, which made sense because of how devastating and brutal the occupations were for the Korean peninsula. Context, everything, right, y'all?
2024 public opinion poll in South Korea indicated that as much as 76% of the nation's people would be in favor of their country developing its own nuclear deterrent.
Not surprising,
A second
right?
poll, summarized in a 2024 report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, found support under 40%, but found that over half of those opposed said that they'd change their stance if they became concerned that the United States might renege on its security pledges to the country.
Yeah. Makes sense. Basically saying, how much do you trust the United States in that scenario? No.
Before we consider the logistics involved with either effort, it's important to understand the context behind both. In both nations, a major source of concern is the United States.
He said the C
where
word.
Donald Trump's second term as president has led to widespread concern among US allies. Those allies, from the nations of NATO to Taiwan and more, fear that Washington under Trump either might not honor its commitments to defend other nations in times of war, or at least is not going to make any firm pledges either way until the time comes.
And a lot of that seems maybe confusing for some countries as well. Seeing, and maybe just depends on the administration again. I mean, there's been a lot of similarities of foreign policy between the major political parties in the United States when it comes to foreign policy. There's been a lot of the parties being very close when it comes to things. I mean, look at the Cold War as an example, where both parties basically ran on anti-communism, being tough against the Soviet Union. Now with the Soviet Union's collapse becomes a little bit kind of different there. Is it still, you think, rolling the dice to think the United States will support your country in that way? People talk about that with like the United States' support of like Israel in their conflict.
Regardless of what Trump and his inner circle would ultimately choose in a moment of crisis, the ambiguity of the situation is pushing these other nations to think carefully about how they manage their own defense. Nations like France and Britain have demonstrated interest in coalition building without the US, while Canada and others are working to reduce their dependence on American weapon systems. Poland and South Korea are two rapidly militarizing nations who consider themselves to be on the front lines of future conflicts.
He's talking about Canada. Do you think Canada has a context for being like, we need nuclear weapons?
Two rapidly militarizing nations who consider themselves to be on the front lines of future conflicts. South Korea anticipating a confrontation with the North, China and Poland expecting to be NATO's primary battlefield in a future war with Russia. For both nations,
Korea being a war zone for a war with Russia? Do you really?
Nuclear deterrent could be a very valuable tool to demonstrate that they are simply not to be messed with. On the logistical end, a push toward nuclear weapons would be easier for South Korea than it would be for Poland. South Korea exists in a state of high nuclear latency. That is to say, it's a nation that has the requisite technology, expertise, and state infrastructure to build a bomb if needed. South Korea.
They also don't have the intricate web of alliances and just these institutions that kind of bind Poland, I think, a lot more. I think that's something to consider. Like South Korea are probably a lot more free to do what they do. They don't have a NATO to deal with, for example, and with the United States being a clear supporter, unless you want to argue that. I can see why it'd be a lot easier, for South Korea. And again, maybe even provide more of a rationale for deserving such technology.
Korea had a nuclear weapons program through the 1980s and is among the world's most prolific users of civilian nuclear energy, even building itself into a nuclear reactor exporter around the world. By most estimates, it would take South Korea only 2 to 3 years to build its first functional warhead, although that period of time would be the absolute minimum needed to produce bomb-grade fissile
very
materials.
Expensive.
Unlike, say, Japan, another nuclear-latent nation where over 45 tons of bomb-grade plutonium is already set aside, South Korea would need to enrich nuclear material up to the level that it could be useful in weapon form.
If you didn't know, so nuclear power has inevitably been tied in with the discussion, of course, of what to do about nuclear weapons, because nuclear power is just something that you're hearing more and more needing to be what our planet needs to be moving towards for our energy needs. Okay. Fear, of course, is that maybe that could be abused into, using nuclear material to nuclear weapons. Now, one thing we do know is the enriching process to get something up to the level that would be used for a weapon is very, very high, right? It's not just right above the bar of what you can use for nuclear power. It's much, much, much higher. That was a big concern that was stated, about Iran. So after the kind of the nuclear deal basically, crumbles with the Trump administration had come in, you started to see them enrich, well beyond the levels needed for nuclear power, which was, cited as a concern that the United States ended intervening with the attacks last year. So you inevitably bring in that conversation about enriching for nuclear power. But again, it's very easy to tell, unless you've done some kind of insane hiding of this process, which is very hard to do. It's very easy to see and to analyze who's doing that.
Poland, by contrast, is not currently host to any civilian nuclear power installations, with the nation's first reactors expected sometime after 2030.
They don't have any.
Nor is Poland known to have the institutional knowledge that comes with a prior nuclear program. The nation hosted Soviet bombs during the Cold War,
just like Ukraine.
Nuclear weapons for Poland are probably at least 5 years away if the nation decided to start a nuclear program tomorrow and then went full throttle to get there. There's a slight possibility of France coming in to offer support, another nuclear ally like the US pitching in, or even South Korea, with whom Poland is becoming very close, seeking to establish a joint program or a framework of mutual support.
Okay, so they either want, and it looks like the French is who they're dealing with, for either French assurances of nuclear protection or to work with them. Okay. Now, with Poland, was it the same scenario that I heard of with Ukraine, that, okay, those nukes were there, but they didn't really have access to be able to launch them. It had to go through, the Kremlin, get the launch codes and stuff like that. I would think so. Correct me if I'm wrong, if it's different than the Ukraine situation.
2030, however, is about the most rushed timeline that we could possibly conceive. And then there's a third nation we have to consider, one that's believed to have nuclear breakout capability as we speak. That would be Iran, firmly on the opposite side of the world's current geopolitical divides. According to recent estimates, Iran is believed to have accelerated its production of near-weapons-grade uranium, something that Iran has been doing for quite some time. Basically, Iran enriches its uranium not to the point where it's weapons-grade, but to the point where it would only need a couple of weeks more of enrichment at the very most before it became weapons-grade.
Now, under the deal that they were under, which lifted a lot of sanctions in return for basically assurances of not enriching to those high levels, there were international inspections that went on in Iran, and from what I believe, there was a hearing to that and to the agreements that they had set there. But then that changed after 2016. Of
course,
it kind of sounded like he was saying that it was being enriched, possibly even during the Iran nuclear deal that went back. When did that start? Towards the end of the Obama presidency, right? Probably like middle of the 2010s, if I remember right.
Just having weapons-grade uranium isn't the same as having a nuclear bomb, and it would take Iran more than a couple of weeks to actually build a working weapon and a warhead to deliver it to an enemy target. Right. But even that capability is placed, according to some estimates, just a few months away from the time that Iran flips the switch from its current posture to an all-out push for a nuke.
That has almost seemed impossible to gauge, because you may have heard rhetoric, whether it's just posturing or whatever, it's like they're days away, you know what I mean? And some are like, no, they're months or years away. It seems like that always bounced around, mostly because it was, there was a lot in recent years, probably a lot less transparency about this, enrichment over the last few years.
Even the more conservative estimates suggest that Iran could get there within 2 years. Once that's done, the nation already has nuclear-capable missiles. It's just a matter of loading up the warhead and hitting that big red button.
Right.
So, between Poland, South Korea, and Iran, the world has three currently non-nuclear powers that are each actively considering the possibility. Each of them has the means, to varying degrees, to do exactly that. And arms control experts estimate that all three of the nations could get there by or before 2030 if they all started working at full throttle toward that goal today.
All right, so they've talked about those three countries, but I want to brush past and give you guys a chance to think about and to maybe respond. What other countries do you think should be put on a list where it's comparable to having, I guess, the motive and potentially the means to making their weapons? What other countries should be brought up in this discussion? Who else should we be talking about? What do you think? Let me know down below, like who you think has a legitimate chance if given the opportunity to make them, and maybe the motive and context to justify such a thing. Let me know down below.
Before 2030, if they all started working at full throttle toward that goal today. On its face, that's already
there it goes.
A possibility.
Nuclear India.
It sets up a scenario where the world goes from 9 nuclear nations to 12 in the span of just half a decade.
They just blew up Kansas. Goodbye, Mr. Beat. Sorry.
But that's not why we're here today. We're here to account for a far more frightening reality that if these three nations, Iran, Poland, and South Korea, were to really start traveling down the path to proliferation, they would not be the only nations making the attempt. And it's,
by the way, we're always open to more alternate history discussions. With that, there's three of us that are part of the production. Okay, we have a writer. I do the on-air stuff with that. And then we have an editor, but always looking for, hypotheticals. Could there be one around nukes that you think would be an interesting topic for us to think about with alternate history? Let me know down below too.
Here that we start down the path toward a worst case scenario.
All right.
So here's the hypothetical question that we're going to seek to answer today. If Poland, Iran, and South Korea began known, confirmed efforts to build a bomb, not necessarily if they produce a finished product, but if they start down that path, then who else would? How fast could those other nations get a warhead? And once that nuclear cascade starts, where's it end?
Yeah, don't you think it's pretty safe to say if all of a sudden, like, whatever international community that probably with the people of the non-poliferation treaty who really are supposed to collectively decide about the future of nuclear weapons, if they were like, all right, you three can have it, don't you definitely think that other countries would be like, wait, what about us? Why not us? And then how would you deal with that? Just like some case-by-case scenario? I don't know.
Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the Warfronts newsletter.
Zelensky,
Every week,
as well as
you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below.
Overall, by the way, do you guys like, Warfront's coverage of these kind of, foreign things, foreign geopolitics and stuff? Now, of course, I see in the comments, of course, with all of these, which is like, well, go to, the host countries about information. And obviously here we've looked at third party stuff. But I don't know. What do you think? How do you think they do? If there's a way you could be objective about their analysis, right?
Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. NATO. So let's start with the nations of NATO, where if Poland were to start working toward the development of a nuclear bomb, there's one other nation that would be a prime candidate to follow suit. That would be the nation of Turkey, where the nation's increasingly autocratic leader, President Erdogan, has hinted at developing the bomb for more than half a decade.
By the way, I think the context of why Turkey is in NATO is also interesting, as it was definitely seen, especially by the Americans, as advantageous to have Turkey as a member, especially early on in the Cold War, because of its proximity to Russia. So with the Soviet Union being so close to them, the United States was putting nukes there, which, were troublesome in the eyes of the Soviet Union, and was used to justify the Soviet Union, putting nukes in Cuba after the Cuban Revolution after that. But that being a major part of the context of why Turkey, if that seems, random, you know what I mean? North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? North Atlantic, right? It's like, they're nowhere near there. And there hasn't been as much of a history of, say, like United States with Turkey or, the former Ottoman Empire and all the issues that have happened with that. World War I, although they, sided with Germany.
Back in 2019, during a larger spat with the United States, Erdogan explicitly pushed back against prohibitions that have kept Turkey from procuring nuclear weapons. Quoting here, "Some countries have missiles with nuclear warheads. Not one or two, but we can't have them. This I cannot accept. There is no developed nation in the world that doesn't have them." Putting aside the accept, there is no developed nation in the world that doesn't have them.
That's not true.
Putting aside the factual dilemmas with that last statement, Erdogan has been laying the groundwork for a long time for Turkey to develop the same sort of nuclear deterrent that can be found in Israel. At present, Turkey is one of several nations that hosts American nuclear warheads, and it, like many of the other nations we're going to discuss, is a signatory to both the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Then again,
that's definitely been an outcry for a lot of countries that would like nukes, is the fact that Israel has not gone into the non-proliferation treaty. But at the same time, they haven't necessarily even officially announced their existence of nukes, even though it's widely believed that they exist there.
Turkey, like the other nations we'll be discussing, is not historically inclined
so they're like, why does Israel then?
What it perceives to be its own interests, simply to keep its word on international agreements. Turkey does host a civilian nuclear program, with its first plant expected to ultimately supply up to a tenth of the nation's energy needs, and other reactors are on the way. That first reactor, however,
seems to be the future,
as being, quote, proliferation resistant by a range of experts on the subject, similar to a wide range of reactors under the NATO umbrella. It can, however, be used as a valuable experiential teaching tool for Turkish nuclear physicists, making the process of puzzling out a nuclear bomb a bit easier as time goes on.
That's one way to frame it. It'll help us be better at nuclear energy if you allow us, to develop nukes, I guess. Is that what he was meaning?
Physicists making the process of puzzling out a nuclear bomb a bit easier as time goes on. Meanwhile, Turkey appears to be working surreptitiously toward the goal of nuclear weaponization, with the nation seemingly securing rights to access uranium in Niger in 2024. During the last few years, the idea has also picked up strength among the nationalist supporters of the Erdogan government, and it's become increasingly normalized.
Nationalists everywhere are going to want nukes.
For now,
any country.
Turkey has been kept mostly in check by international leaders, partly due to the nation's protection under America's nuclear umbrella, and partially due to the international pressures on Turkey to maintain NATO-approved good behavior. But There's a reason to believe that in the world we just laid out, where both Poland and Iran are moving toward acquiring a nuclear weapon, Turkey would very quickly lose any interest in playing nice. On the one hand, a newly nuclearizing Poland would offer Ankara all the justification it needs to approach alliance members and say, the Polish can build a bomb, so why can't we?
And I think it is important to understand, I guess, how important it is for, who's in charge and how they want to act. Like Erdogan very much may act in a way that maybe even, other NATO nations may disagree about. I mean, he's very much a nationalist and will, do things his way in the way that he wants to. So I do think leadership does play a big role.
It's not unthinkable that Poland could face harsh retaliation from NATO nations, attempting to stop its progress, but that outcome isn't terribly likely, especially given NATO desires to place less of its collective defense into American hands. On the other hand, a nuclear Iran would...
Do you think that's the case too? That there's a what word did he use here?
Desires to place less of its collective defense into American hands.
So less of its American defense into hands. It has seemed like NATO has largely been that. I mean, a lot of people talk about really NATO is just like the tentacles of the United States, being having such a big role in like the financing, and when you compare countries putting into NATO. But there was the talk when it was, recently over both Trump administrations of kind of the threat of the United States pulling out of NATO. What do you think that would do? You know what I mean? And in the most recent, over the last few months when that has been discussed, it's kind of put the ball in the court of like these other nations in NATO, the European ones, to have to start thinking to themselves and talk to each other like, does that do anything for us? Like, are we still, or does that just mean we're going to have to double down our efforts to bolster up our capabilities? Will that in any way change? Like, let's say if United States just wants to cut off all aid to like Ukraine, does that mean other countries, Ukraine's not NATO, but like NATO countries, offering supports? And they've basically come out and said that like we would still operate the way that we do. Those countries. Would it be as important? Would the United States leaving NATO be more of a motivating factor for, like Russia, for example, to invest more into its conflicts into Europe? That's interesting to talk about too. And I guess you guys put this down below. What do you overall think about the role the United States has in NATO in both its current form and what could happen to it if the US did say just pull out of it completely?
On the other hand, a nuclear Iran would be an even more powerful motivator than a nuclear Poland. Turkey is working hard to position itself as a new power in the Middle East, and if both Iran and Israel were to be nuclear armed, it would be very difficult to make an effective argument to Ankara that it should do anything but acquire the bomb to match. As for a timeline...
That is an interesting thing that people have talked about too, of like, Iran, should Iran get it? If Iran got a nuclear weapon, would that actually be more of a deterrent of war in some way? Like in the Middle East, with so many countries getting tangled up in that. Now, we have seen the relationship with Israel having them and Iran having them, and Israel, of course, never using them. But I don't know. Think that could lead to a deterrence of future conflicts between those countries and countries around them? Or do you think it's a very different scenario than the other countries involved when we usually talk about mutually assured destruction and its deterrence, the Iran-Israel situation? What do you think about that?
Tougher to say with Turkey than with the other nations, partly due to that proliferation-resistant nature of its current program. Perhaps Turkey could use the knowledge gained at its new reactor to great effect, enriching uranium sourced in Africa and possibly even leveraging Russian involvement in its reactor.
Africa's got a lot of it, don't they?
Of Russian nuclear scientists. Civil nuclear programs can also provide...
Africa's going to be involved in this one way or the other.
Weaponize until it's too late. But Turkey still would need lots of time to enrich weapons-grade uranium, learn how to construct an actual nuclear warhead, and integrate that warhead onto a missile or some other delivery mechanism. Another nuclear arms...
What does Turkey believe is their biggest existential threat? So they've had a lot of, positive dealings with like Israel, for example. I mean, is it against smaller ethnic groups, or is it against like terror organizations, the Kurds? Like, maybe we wouldn't think of that as existential of a threat.
Pakistan might even be willing to grant Turkey direct support as part of the two nations'
Pakistan does have
strategic alliance, which has
nuclear
long
weapons.
been suspected to include a nuclear dimension.
Got
So,
in the
on a
90s,
timeline,
right?
we unfortunately can't give any hard estimates here. Let's just say it would probably take Turkey longer than 3 years, but less than 10. Across the rest of Europe, it's not readily apparent that any particular nation would seek to acquire nuclear weapons if Poland and South Korea did. Several nations
Think Ukraine? No, you think Ukraine would? Seems there's immediate context to build that narrative. Finland ended up joining NATO pretty quick.
any particular nation would seek to acquire nuclear weapons if Poland and South Korea did. Several nations, including Italy, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands, as well as Turkey, currently host US warheads, and of those nations, none are currently expressing any desire to pick up nuclear capability of their own. Germany in particular has long been opposed to the idea that it would procure nuclear weapons, and even decided to end its civil nuclear program after the disaster at Fukushima in 2011. More on.
But would they say that if the United States wasn't hosting those there? Do you think that would have an effect? Or is it truly like a, I don't know, noble endeavor?
Decided to end its civil nuclear program after the disaster at Fukushima in 2011. More on Germany later.
Well, that's for
Other
nuclear
European
power,
nations
though.
Aren't particularly likely to restart the nuclear programs they once ran in secret, like Sweden, while Norwegian thinkers advocating a push for a Nordic bomb have been rebuked by their own government in recent months. Both Sweden and neighboring Finland, however, have expressed an
Were any of you wondering if he was going to do the error that everyone gets roasted on about Finland not being Scandinavian? Got to use the Nordic word, right? Oh, some of you were amping. You were getting your fingers close to that keyboard. I know you're opening up that text window. You just were hoping for that.
rebuked by their own government in recent months. Both Sweden and neighboring Finland, however, have expressed an openness to hosting nuclear weapons.
Also joining NATO.
This perhaps is the more likely
After the
outcome
Russian
for
invasion
European
here.
nations, with existing nuclear powers, particularly France, being more likely to grow their nuclear arsenals than for new nations to create their own. France, under Emmanuel Macron, has pushed hard to expand its nuclear umbrella in recent months. In a world where Poland and South Korea have been driven to develop the bomb, where US support is thus probably perceived as waning, and where rules against nuclear proliferation seem to be waning as well, France might be able to expand its arsenal more easily. In fact,
What are they using as their big, I guess, justification for that expansion? Is it an existential threat, or more just thinking in generalities of, the future of, just the future, I guess? And of course, there's been, world wars that France has had, but those threats and much smaller than they were 100 years ago.
it may actually be under pressure to do so in a world where the European Union is forced to see France's fewer than 300 warheads as its primary nuclear deterrent. Macron has drawn criticism domestically for his
300 's still a
suggestions to
lot.
become a continent-wide nuclear guarantor, but it's not clear that such opposition would remain as strong as it is now in a world where the nuclear order was shifting more broadly. As for a timeline, it would likely take France the better part of a decade to add just 100 warheads to its arsenal under the present conditions, but greater investment into the nation's nuclear program could address that challenge, given that France already has all the knowledge required to expand the program.
They got nuclear subs. A lot of, nukes are on submarines. United States has that, so it's out and about everywhere, across the world. All right, who's next?
The Middle East and Africa.
Okay.
Moving on from Europe, we come to the Middle East, where a combination of an Iranian bomb, a Turkish bomb, and a pre-existing Israeli bomb could bring with them a whole wide range of knock-on effects. In this corner of the world, we're looking at several nations that would be forced
Saudi
into a
Arabia,
delicate dance that we'll refer
Egypt.
to as the petrostate shuffle. Each of these highly ambitious, very wealthy nations, already with nuclear power initiatives underway, would probably feel considerable pressure to respond in kind, simply in order to not be left out of a new arms race. The first and most important nation to consider here is Saudi Arabia, the fourth and arguably final of the Middle East's regional powers at the time of writing.
Well, the United States and Saudi Arabia being so close with their deal, especially when it comes to military aid, could probably be the closest, right?
Saudi Arabia has openly acknowledged its intent to build a nuclear arsenal on the condition that Iran develops one, and that's a sentiment that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has refused to back away from despite international pressure. In
Saudi Arabia and Iran are adversaries, if you did not know.
fact, Its warning MBS has issued repeatedly since 2018, suggesting that Saudi Arabia does take its own warning seriously and may have plans in place to establish some form of nuclear program if Iran does cross the gap. Saudi officials have long sought nuclear coverage under America's nuclear umbrella, but have resisted US attempts to impose the nation's usual anti-proliferation requirements, leading to a situation now where Saudi Arabia appears unlikely to settle for a US deterrent. The nation...
How important do you guys think it is if we start getting these new, these other countries of really putting the pressure on entering non-proliferation treaties, right? So you really have to agree to a lot of things about how these weapons are developed and how that information can spread. Like, how important do you think that is? And is there a way to, I guess, require it? Is it enforceable? And how would you enforce it, I guess? I mean, the easiest way would be just not to give them, you know, the know-how and their materials to do that. But if they do it completely on their own, what is the deterrent? Is it like an Iran situation where a country like the US just bombs those facilities?
Been pursuing a nuclear program for years and is well on its way to bringing a reactor online while it's stockpiled nuclear ore for many years. According to The Guardian, Saudi Arabia in 2020 already had enough uranium ore to purchase some 90,000 tons of purified uranium.
Is uranium found in Saudi Arabia?
The nation's energy minister revealed plans to develop a full nuclear cycle, producing
naturally
uranium,
occurring,
enriching it, and then producing nuclear fuel, which Saudi Arabia plans in turn to eventually export. The nation already has intercontinental ballistic missiles that could allow it to mount warheads, courtesy of China, but with the reported sign-off of the American CIA. Under the hegemony of the US,
CIA is going to be involved in all these.
It's not likely that Saudi Arabia would run into sanctions if it were to seek the bomb in a war where Iran's nuclear program had gone operational. That said, the nation would probably need international support to quickly develop elements of a nuclear weapons program that it currently lacks. But that's something it could solicit either from the friendly US or friendly China, and given the dynamic between those two nations, an element of competition may make both potential backers more eager to agree. In a worst-case scenario, Saudi Arabia may need 5 years to get nuclear weapons operational, but it's probably less. From Saudi Arabia, we've got to look at the nation's next-door neighbor, the United Arab Emirates. The UAE is generally thought of as being a nation that's more resistant to its nuclear urges than others in the region, owing in large part to a collaborative agreement with the United States that is widely regarded as the global gold standard when getting nations with civil nuclear programs to commit to avoiding weapons production.
I mean, United Arab Emirates basically was, created with a foreign policy of, being very favorable to these other countries, right? All the laws and stuff that make it very favorable to do business and to operate with them. And of course, it's led to an insane amount of wealth, right, for the Emirates there. So yeah, this one makes more sense. Far less of an adversary, it seems, to the big countries in the world.
But at the same time, the UAE is already considerably more advanced on nuclear power than either Turkey or Saudi Arabia.
They have plans,
as of 2024, the UAE is operating all 4 reactors at its first nuclear power plant and has plans to build more. Here, the considerations are geopolitical. The UAE shares a growing rivalry with Saudi Arabia, with the two nations now competing on a larger scale each year. We'll certainly grant you that there's something of a deep measuring element to the whole thing, but that doesn't necessarily make the rivalry less serious. And when it comes to international measuring, there is no greater triumph than procuring a nuclear weapon. For the UAE to sit quietly by while Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Iran all acquire nuclear weapons, it's not a likely situation.
I mean, I could definitely see Saudi Arabia being motivated by Iran. Would the Emirates have as much of that direct motivation from that? That I don't know. I wouldn't think, as far as what I know about the scenario.
While the nation's gold standard agreement with the US would almost certainly preclude an Emirati bomb in today's world, we're not talking about today's world right now. We're talking about a hypothetical world where the international nuclear order is already breaking down rapidly and where today's approach to arms control has already been turned on its head. The UAE is one of those nations with a nuclear program that's currently understood to be proliferation proof. But if the Emirates were to start down the path to a bomb, we'd have to place them on the same vague timeline as Turkey.
So by proliferation proof, has he been meaning like having no desires to even make it appear like they're interested in it going into a nuclear weapon, that it's just purely, on development of nuclear energy? Is that kind of what I've been deducing?
on the path to a bomb would have to place them on the same vague timeline as Turkey. Maybe as few as 3 years, maybe as many as 10. But in this case, with the potential added benefit of help from nations looking to spite the Saudis on their own
beautiful
doorstep.
place.
Other petrostates worthy of consideration here also include Qatar and Azerbaijan, although neither nation appears to be in a position to start a nuclear weapons program anytime soon, so we'll leave them aside today.
Unless they like someone like Azerbaijan, and I guess Qatar too, which but getting an incredible amount of support if they deeply go on alliances. But Azerbaijan had issues with the people around them, like the Soviet Union and Armenia, or whatever. But then Qatar trying to be more of at least trying to present itself more as a intermediary, I guess you would say, of Arab nations.
Moving to North Africa, the nation of Egypt, itself a neighbor to Saudi Arabia in all but the most pedantic technicalities, is another rising power that deserves consideration. After years on ice, Egypt restarted its nuclear power program in 2013, with that program now well underway as the nation builds the El Dabar nuclear power plant on the Mediterranean coast.
You think their biggest motivating part would maybe be during like the Nasser years, when they were really trying to, lead coalitions against like Israel and having those wars with them, but now that they're on much better terms and have a lot of agreements with like Israel, where would their existential threat, I guess, be coming from? Would it be Iran?
Russian-backed initiative should yield a functioning reactor within the next decade.
As it breaks down with Israel,
has expressed interest in a second reactor as well. Egypt is another of those nations with nuclear weapons in its past and has conducted experimentation into other weapons of mass destruction, working toward offensive biological weapons and deploying chemical weapons in the 1960s.
Can you guys help me with that? I do not know at all about Egypt's history with like nuclear weapons. Where did that come from? How was that developed? What happened? I'm not knowledgeable at all in that situation.
The nation has ample delivery mechanisms for a nuclear weapon, and prominent ex-military officials have suggested that in a world where Iran obtains nuclear weapons, and especially if Turkey and Saudi Arabia did, then Egypt would be forced to procure weapons of its own. And even
You've seen a lot of countries and their decision for it connected to Iran, huh? Do you think these are all fair connections too?
The threat of a nuclear Middle East wasn't enough to prompt an Egyptian bomb. A nuclear Ethiopia almost certainly would. Egypt and Ethiopia are cultivating an emerging and bitter rivalry in northern Africa at a time when Ethiopia, under its own autocrat Abiy Ahmed, is working hard to become a regional power somewhere between Erdogan and Kim Jong-un on the unpredictability spectrum. Ethiopia has considerable leverage over Egypt by way of its ability to control the flow of the Nile River, whereas Egypt is rapidly aligning itself with other nations that are concerned about Ethiopia's disruptive potential in the region.
I've done some reaction stuff and needed to learn a lot about, but like Ethiopia and Somalia with in that whole region of Eastern Africa, how there's just been continued these movements of some places, some of those some regions within those countries of trying to become their own nation state to get like self-determination, and how much that has caused problems there.
Ahmed has asked France to station nuclear missiles on Ethiopian territory as far back as 2019, and the nation is working on a civilian nuclear program as well via cooperation with Russia. Ethiopia, along with most of Africa, has long advocated the preservation of the continent as a nuclear weapons-free zone. But quite frankly, if there's any leader that would be prompted to abandon those pledges at a time when nuclear proliferation is ongoing, it's Abiy Ahmed.
I think it's important to note that with all the African countries they're going to be talking about how the Cold War played a role in these countries developing relationships with East or West, with Russia or the United States, especially Soviet Union, but as they were getting their independence from the European colonies all throughout the 20th century, how those countries, opened up communication and also state building with the aid of these countries. So for a lot of these countries, they already have ties to nuclear powers. But again, it's because these nations, the United States and Soviet Union, really saw Africa as like a sandbox, pretty much, of new countries being developed that you could kind of try to mold in your own image, I guess.
Ethiopia would probably take quite a while.
Somalia had that same thing
on its own, if it could ever get there at all. Unfortunately, however, it's not clear that Ethiopia would have to go it alone. Again, we're talking about a world where the Middle East is already going nuclear and fast. We're talking about a world
not in the Middle
where
East,
the old order of non-proliferation,
not too far.
today's world order, is breaking down quickly. In that environment, given Ahmed's broader desire to turn Ethiopia into a regional power and Ahmed's proven tendency to disregard all manner of international rules and norms, a push to develop a nuclear warhead might not be far off, and support from any place from the UAE to Russia may be coming along as well.
Do you think Ethiopia, though, and their leader would have to really ally itself with another country? Because a lot of those type of leaders don't like to do that. Give up maybe some of their autonomy and have a bunch of strings attached to be able to get something like the technology and resources, infrastructure to develop nuclear weapons. I don't know enough about Ethiopia's leadership right now or what state they're really in for developing such a thing. But if it is to the extent that he's saying that you have this, power hungry leader or whatever, would he be willing to potentially give up some autonomy to grow his power? Some do, some don't in history.
In that environment, Egypt would have little option but to either pursue a bomb itself or to shroud itself in the protection of another nuclear nation's umbrella. And although Egypt and Ethiopia are both far off, each of them could get there within a decade if they were to secure the right international support. Hell, let's just call it 15 years to be safe. And finally,
you'd also have to have some incredible stability of your state and your government. And we know some of these countries have had that problem. Right, if you could secure that the success of your country and not have, nearly as many civil wars or economic collapses and that kind of thing, that will probably play a factor, especially for these countries where you're talking about they're 15 years off. A lot can happen in your country in 15 years. All right, who's next?
If Ethiopia were to go nuclear, then there's one other nation that would start to look
Eritrea?
Eritrea. Outwardly, a state in such obvious internal shambles as Eritrea wouldn't be a likely
Italy
country
wakes
to build
up.
a nuclear weapon or even come close. The trouble, however, is the closeness between a nation often referred to as the North Korea of Africa and the actual nation of North Korea. Eritrea.
If you want to know what he's talking about like the North Korea of Africa, I covered a video from, I think it was Hoser, right? That went all into that. It was really fascinating because you don't hear or talk much about Eritrea, but it's pretty interesting what's going on down there. Are they really the North Korea of Africa? There's some interesting parallels, I guess. But check that one out too. It was coverage. I think it was Hoser, Hoser, that I covered.
Eritrea has long worked to push back against that North Korea of Africa label, but the nation shares ties with North Korea, and the two nations have even engaged in under-the-table military collaboration. In a world where things have gotten incredibly grim, and even Ethiopia is looking at acquiring warheads, Eritrea would be under real pressure to at least try asking North Korea for support, either to station North Korean warheads as a deterrent, or even to help Eritrea develop its own program.
I'm trying to remember, though, in their history, like, when they say North Korea of Eritrea, they mostly act about how they operate, but like them actually being like homies, I don't remember that. Is that true?
North Korean warheads as a deterrent, or even to help Eritrea develop its own program, similar to the circumstances under which the North really got its program going back in the early 2000s. Given the chance for North Korea to both make a profit by selling nuclear secrets and to start building a little sphere of influence a whole continent away, it's not necessarily assured that Pyongyang would tell Eritrea no. East Asia and Europe again.
Okay.
Moving on from a scenario.
East Asia, what are we going to be? So, East Asia, you're talking about Korea, China, and Japan. So, Japan, Taiwan.
Really hope will remain a somewhat
motivation there.
Hypothetical. We'll travel to East Asia, where among the three new nuclear powers we chose to prompt this arms race, South Korea is by far the most relevant. If South Korea were to begin a nuclear weapons program, it's all but assured that North Korea would step up its own efforts to the extent that it's able to do so. But
yeah, would that just create a crazy arms race, do you think? Like a nuclear arms race? Now, it does seem with the economies of both that could really, really hurt North Korea. If that happened, would it, have the same stress on the state that like the Soviet Union had when trying to economically compete to try to keep building up these weapons against the United States? I mean, if you remember, that was Reagan's kind of big strategy. It was almost like win it through the arms race. bankrupt them.
It's the threat of a potentially more aggressive, more belligerent North Korea that draws in the nation of Japan. Of course, it should be no surprise to find out that
They don't
Japan,
have a military.
as the only world nation ever to have nuclear weapons used against it, is not particularly friendly to the idea of a nuclear program of its own. But at the same time, Japan is easily the world nation with the most firmly established latent capability to produce nuclear weapons.
Yeah, they're killing it in nuclear power,
Japan,
other than they had that Fukushima disaster was awful. That did show how, even in the modern era, how there's still problems, the threats that can happen, the disasters about nuclear power. That's the problem. It's like nuclear power is it could be such a fantastic things, but the problem is their problems are huge problems as opposed to the other, issues we might have with solar power. We don't have to worry about mass extinction. You know what I mean? If the solar panels break down, but yeah, this would have the United States would have to play a huge role in this, because we don't know, after, the whole government was replaced basically in Japan. Japan got demilitarized. Basically, they can't have any kind of army with the offensive capabilities, like a very small kind of defense force. But the United States basically being like, we're taking over the military decisions and actual actions if it needs be.
Abandoned its goal to phase out nuclear power after the 2011 Fukushima disaster and is now working to increase its reliance on civilian nuclear energy with the intent of supplying a fifth of the nation's electricity that way by 2030. As a result of its long-running nuclear power program, Japan is in possession of quite a bit of weapons-grade plutonium. At the same time, it's become the only nation in the world that possesses a full nuclear fuel cycle without nuclear weapons, and it's a nation with robust delivery mechanisms for a warhead if it ever decided to make one. Japan has innumerable nuclear scientists of its own, plus an exceptionally close relationship with the United States, to the point that a Japanese effort to build a warhead might even enjoy direct American support under the right circumstances. In all, Japan is sitting on enough plutonium to create well over 5,000 nuclear bombs through that method alone, without even accounting for the enriched uranium in Japan's possession. The nation's current prime minister has called for Japan to consider sharing US nuclear weapons on its soil, and former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe brought nuclear weapons back into the national discourse after decades of treating them as taboo after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While the Japanese public is not currently in favor of acquiring a nuclear bomb, it may face a similar situation to South Korea, where changing international circumstances could drive the public to change their minds. Right. If South Korea believes it's got to develop a bomb, probably because of signs of waning US support that Japan would observe too, then the likely outcomes from North Korean aggression to broader regional destabilization and a potential invasion of Taiwan would push Japan to act quickly.
Does the United States have their own nukes in South Korea? I don't know that. I don't know all of the places. I didn't look it up. I don't think it's been that long ago about where U.S. actually has that kind of stuff installed. With all of the rhetoric and seeming hostility the U.S. has had with North Korea, it seems like the United States would. But like we were saying before, there's also nuclear submarines and all that. So.
Although there's no concrete timeline for Japan to produce a warhead if it began work today, a conservative estimate would place the latency period at just 6 months, and under the right circumstances, it could do the job in a mere fraction of that time. Less likely to take the plunge, but not entirely unlikely, is the nation of Australia, where public opinion on nuclear matters has shifted rapidly in recent years. From a nation that was long hesitant to engage with anything even remotely nuclear-shaped, Australia now appears as if it may construct reactors at no fewer than 7 sites nationwide if the leader of Australia's opposition, Peter Dutton, is elected to office.
Do the British have them there? Does Britain have nukes stationed in other countries, especially like their Commonwealth nations? I got to get current on this stuff about where nukes are right now.
The nation is also developing nuclear-powered submarines with American and British support, and it's host to a full 1/3 of the uranium deposits worldwide. The nation previously formed a plan to develop plutonium for nuclear weapons production during the Cold War, and today almost 2/3 of Australians support both the adoption of nuclear power and the adoption of nuclear submarines. Both figures are...
nuclear submarines, and what they're talking about too is like nuclear power submarines. One of the problems, of course, for any ship is having to refuel, right? So that limits what your range can be and that kind of thing. But nuclear powered submarines, which are a thing now, like I believe can basically operate forever. There's an infinite amount of power. You know, you're going to need to dock more because of, you know, like food or something like that than you will of power.
Vastly increased from prior decades, and so is this one. 36% of Australians in support of acquiring nuclear weapons in 2022, as opposed to just 20% in support back in 2010.
Interesting. I kind of thought that would be higher, didn't you? Look at the graph again.
Its position, and in a world where the developments abroad may well prompt the Australian public to shift its position, and in a developments abroad may well prompt 20% in support.
Think about Australia's defense. Would you be in favor or against Australia acquiring nuclear weapons in the future? This was in 2022. Biggest chunk was strongly against and then somewhat against. So you combine those together and you've got a majority. Somewhat in favor, 25%. Strongly in favor, 11%. Interesting. There's a bit, or the percentage that don't know. They're like, what's that mean? Crikey.
Report back in 2010. Again, developments abroad may well prompt the Australian public to shift its position, and in a world where the United States may begin to pull back from its international partnerships, it's Australia, alongside Japan and South Korea, that would form a bulwark against Chinese ambitions in the Pacific. Again.
Okay. Hey, if you as a viewer are not from a country that has their own nuclear weapons, what do you think about it? Trying to consider all the things that would entail. What would it do for your country? What would it do for the geopolitics of your region? What do you think about how favorable are you of having those in your country? Let me know down below too.
It's not something that Australia would be likely to jump for tomorrow, but this is a nuclear cascade we're talking about in a hypothetical moment when Australia would risk being left behind. And if Japan were to utilize its breakout potential and
all it takes is a huge nationalist movement, though,
enough,
anywhere.
We have to turn back to continental Europe and evaluate one more contender, Germany. As we mentioned before, Germany is a nation where the US currently stations warheads, but it's also a nation that has been deeply reticent to develop its own nuclear weapons program for a very long time. In fact, a large part of Germany's hesitance has actually come by following Japan's lead. As the two nations that led the losing coalition in the most devastating war in human history, Japan and Germany have made it a point to avoid seeking out weapons of mass destruction. And as mentioned earlier, Germany even swore off its civil nuclear program after the Fukushima disaster of 2011, even after Japan reversed course on its own deactivation initiative. Yet as we've seen in...
Do you think any of that, like with Japan or Germany, after the war, Germany, of course, gets divided, but their military needs were basically propped up by either the United States or the Soviet Union. And in Japan, of course, by the United States. Now, one thing that ended up helping, I see you would say, for those countries is to rebuild their economies without having to invest in the insane amount of money that they used to in the World War years into their military. I mean, again, if you think about like any country like the United States, what could the United States do on the home front economically if it did not have to support a military, if it got completely supported by some other country? It's probably one of the reasons, again, why these countries are able to economically bounce back, unlike so many other countries in the world that after war they can't, is literally don't have to really pay for a military. You can do so much more with your money if you don't have to do that. Build up an economy, provide social services, all that stuff.
Many other world nations, the German public is slowly reversing course on nuclear weapons, with a 2022 poll finding for the first time in decades that a majority of the public approved of the presence of US nuclear weapons in Germany. The country's former leader, Olaf Scholz, spent a portion of his time pushing against nuclearization talk in Germany, but now Scholz is voted out, and his successor, Friedrich Merz, is pushing for weapons sharing agreements with Britain
Christian
and
Democratic
France.
Union.
Germany has the technical capabilities to invest in a nuclear program if it wished to, and although the nation still doesn't seem inclined to build those weapons today, the combination of a new nuclear neighbor in Poland, plus a tacit or even explicit expression of support from a nuclearizing Japan, could be enough to push Germany over the edge. If the nation were to reverse course, unlikely as that may be, it may not take very long to go operational between its technical knowledge, military assets, and likely support from several world nations.
Again, I think it still depends on and countries, I think, are always very, very close to ultranationalist movements. We've seen that. Germany's had elements of that too, especially when, as you've seen a lot of them in response to like global immigration, which has kind of indirectly led to a lot of nationalist movements inside of countries. You would think that, along with those nationalist movements would be more support of nuclear weapons. All right, who else?
A more likely outcome.
Okay.
So, there we have it. A worst-case scenario in which a couple of nations' stated intent to acquire nuclear weapons sets off a global cascade that leaves the world with a full 20 nuclear nations or more by the year 2040. We've said it before. Over the course of this episode, we'll say it again. This scenario would constitute a full breakdown of the post-World War II nuclear order, a complete abandonment of the modern rules of non-proliferation that govern today's world. Perhaps, in such a world, not all the nations we discussed would ultimately take the leap, but perhaps others would, like Brazil, or Canada, or Italy, or even more.
I think at the beginning of the video when I was asking you about other countries that might get involved, and they went through more of them, I didn't say it, but one of the ones that kind of crossed my mind was, looking at all the continents would be, with South America, who would be the most likely? And it clearly would be Brazil, right? As far as the means to do it. I mean, I don't know if a place like Venezuela would, with the adversarial relationship that, they have had with like the United States or something like that. But someone like Brazil, country with large economy, military.
Luckily, the odds of our worst
What do
case
you think?
scenario.
Most likely South American country. I guess you have to answer it different ways. Like most likely to get also you'd have to answer the question, like, do they have the capability? But what countries, and I don't know this, maybe we can get the data, but which of the countries most likely would want one, would want nukes? And then I guess the second part would be who would be the most likely to actually get them.
Happening are still slim. And the reason why we've chosen to play that worst case scenario out is not because we believe it to be likely to happen. Instead, we lay out this sequence of events with the hope that it can illustrate the
they were
grave
talking about,
importance of the nuclear conversations
who's
going on
killing
today.
who.
From Poland to South Korea to Iran, there are real and ongoing discussions on whether to develop an operational nuclear capability, and even if the thing that comes next isn't our worst case scenario, it could very well be a sequence of repercussions where some parts of the scenario do play out. There are a whole lot of options less bad than the scenario we've explained, that still manage to be very bad in their own right, and by looking at the world in its totality, we can better understand the risk of a smaller cascade in one area or another. The world has 9 nuclear nations today, and we don't actually expect that the world will have 20 by the year 2040. But how certain are we that the world won't have 12? How certain are we that we're not going to be looking at 15?
Here's a question for you. Do you think it's more likely that a bunch of countries, like these countries getting nukes or whatever, and maybe even partially, more likely that more countries are going to get a lot of nukes, or that countries will mutually give them up? Whether or not that means give them up completely or reduce them. Do you guys think it's more likely to basically see the growth, I guess, of the planet, of more nukes being and more widely being developed, or less likely going forward? What do you think if you had to hypothesize the future of that?
It's worth. There are 1 of 12. How certain are we that we're not going to be looking at 15? For what it's worth, there are significant protections that may prevent even the start of this cascade from coming to pass. Iran is under severe international pressure, including the threat of a US bombing campaign as we speak, and hardliners in Washington have indicated that, at least on paper, they're willing to deliver a whole lot of death and destruction to prevent Iran from acquiring the bomb. South Korea and Poland, if they choose to pursue nuclear programs, could each face intense backlash from their allies. Poland ostracized from NATO and sanctioned heavily by the European Union. South Korea's strategy.
Do you think NATO would condemn Poland like bad for doing that? Or they just be like, all right, you're our ally, go for it? Huh. And who would condemn them? Who would be the most likely to condemn them?
Allies, Poland ostracized from NATO and sanctioned heavily by the European Union, South Korea stranded on its own against North Korea, and China on its doorstep. Speaking of adversaries, China or Russia would be just as likely to attempt preemptive action against South Korea and Poland respectively as the US would be against Iran. All those deterrents stacked on top of one another.
Do you agree with that? Think they'd be so bold? If we're saying, would those countries actually carry out strikes like the United States did against, those nuclear sites, against South Korea? I don't know. I just, again, have to think of context, and the U.S. obviously has context.
Could be enough to stop each nation from taking that leap, and the same is true for every other potential proliferator that we've named. But at the same time, we live in a moment where geopolitics more broadly is starting to come off the rails. Long regarded as the guarantor of global security, the world's so-called rules-based international order risks becoming a thing of the past as superpowers, regional powers, minor powers, and tiny nations alike have decided to push even harder against boundaries that international norms were supposed to enforce. From Russia's excursion into Ukraine, to China's potential invasion of Taiwan, to America's potential abandonment of its allies abroad, and so much more, on every single continent, those constraints are growing weaker by the day. The expectation that countries don't pursue nuclear weapons has been rock solid for decades, but not anymore. And if that global rule is up for debate, then how confident are we in the rule above the rule, the global standard that calls for world nations to stand together in opposition when a country does go rogue and pursues the bomb? If that falls apart, then it takes only one nuclear-armed nation supporting allies in their nuclear ambitions for the world to descend into a proliferation race. Just as important is understanding how fast this can all happen.
And does it seem like, it kind of seems like, at least with the connections there, Mike, and you could ask, or they're bringing up, that you can ask yourself, is Iran the country more than all of them that could trigger so many other responses? Is there a country you believe that doesn't have nukes right now that if they got them would trigger more of a response? Like in any way, would Poland do that? And it seems like it'd be Iran, right?
Scenario we played out, we said that all these nations could build a nuclear weapon by or before 2040. But that timeline wouldn't work if, say, Saudi Arabia started building a weapon in response to Turkey only when Turkey had completed its first warhead. In reality, nations that know or even suspect that their adversaries are building a bomb have no incentive to wait until there's proof of detonation in order to start responding. They might try to delay because of the fear of repercussions from that international order that we mentioned is falling apart. But that's the trouble. If nations feel at liberty to start their own nuclear programs as soon as their adversaries do the same, then a cascade like the one we described wouldn't necessarily take years to play out. Hell, a really 6 weeks of diplomatic breakdown might do the job, and we've had a few 6-week stretches like that recently. And finally, we come to the biggest hurdle of all for the non-proliferation advocates. We here at Warfronts, not big fans of describing nations or leaders as being good or evil. Instead, we approach all of them as self-interested actors, doing what they believe
it's your job as the viewer,
even when it may seem contradictory to a broader logic, and even when it may lead to devastating results. And this is the really tricky thing with a nuclear cascade, even if it's just a fraction of the one that we played out. Every single nation that we described acquiring the bomb had its own clear set of incentives in order to take the leap. Nowhere in the conversation did there have to be an absolute mad dictator determined to follow a ludicrous path to its worst conclusion. Sure. Instead, we've got rational nations forming...
I mean, it's the World War II. I mean, it started this domino effect of justifications for developing such a thing. So when just the atomic theory and how that exploded with its discoveries back in like the 20s and into the 30s, and how that just inevitably, it seemed like, puts it on a timeline that you would start talking about nuclear power and potentially, I guess, as a weapon. It almost seemed like inevitable. And then with World War II, bringing the context for motivation to develop one, whether it's for you to use it as an aggressor or, again, to just beat out the other country, like the United States being very motivated as Germany was pursuing their own. And, it's like, even if you don't like it, you got to make sure you get it before the enemy does, and it seems like this inevitable fall of the dominoes, if you will, that's brought us to today, isn't it? If only we had never made those breakthroughs on atomic science.
Responses to other rational nations, all of whom can thoroughly justify the part they individually play in a chain reaction that's bigger than any of them. If an era of sudden nuclear proliferation is going to come from anything, it'll come from this, a moment in history when several nations, perhaps even a dozen or more, each pivot to address new challenges from the world around them. Each nation takes a series of steps that it believes will protect its interests and sovereignty and its place on the world stage, as any nation would. Then, at the logical conclusion of each of these series of steps, those nations find a nuclear warhead. In Poland, in South Korea, and to an extent even in Iran, that is precisely what's happening now. Donald Tusk, Han Duck-seo, and his likely successor Lee Jae-myung, even the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, they're not stupid, and they're not insane. They're marching down the path to a nuclear bomb because that's what they believe makes sense. And it's in a world where nuclear proliferation makes sense that the entire world needs to prepare for what comes next. Thank you for watching.
Final thoughts. All right, I asked you guys a ton of questions, probably more than I do usually, because there were a lot of things I wanted to get your feedback on and a bunch of holes, I guess, in my knowledge on certain situations having to do with nukes. So if you have stood with me for this, well over an hour, it's going to be one of my longest videos ever. Love to hear again what you think about this stuff. So go ahead and get down in the comments there. Again, another great place to talk is over on the Discord server. Although we don't get into a lot of the modern political situations over there, I'm talking about the history and all. That's a great place. Also, great place to recommend videos to me. That's where I go mostly for the video recommendations, is getting it straight from the community that way. So that's linked down in the description. Again, thank you again for everyone that has stood with me here. And if you have stood with me, this way through the video, this far into it, maybe consider being a channel member. Starts $2 a month. It's a way to support the channel, and you're going to get early access to all the videos going forward. So you can do that, be part of the community that way, and we'll see y'all next time.